What's up, painting friends? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Stoof. Today we're going to do an oil painting tutorial to recreate this scene of the Bass Harbor Lighthouse in Acadia National Park in Maine. This painting took me over 10 hours to do. Originally I thought this was going to be a quick one, and then I got caught up in the rocks and had way too much fun painting all of the little colors and shadows and crevices in the rocks. So we're going to speed up this tutorial. This is not going to be in real time, but hopefully this will still provide you with some helpful information to recreate this painting. If you guys do recreate this painting, just remember you're doing it for fun or for educational purposes. Okay, so we started this painting out using the grid method. This was a 12-inch by 16-inch canvas panel, so I separated the grids into 4-inch sections. So I created these 4-inch squares by putting those little tick marks on the canvas, matched that up with the squares on my reference photograph, and then began to sketch the image using thinned down oil paint. I thinned my paint down using citrus solvents, and I'm just using like a darker blue color here. First, just trying to get the accurate angles on this house. I do go back and make some adjustments to this over time while working on the painting. But getting an accurate sketch from the beginning is very helpful. It saves you time when you're painting later on. I also made some adjustments to that lighthouse there. The initial sketch was just slightly off from my reference photo. Started sketching in the tree line in the background and some basic sections of rock here without getting too crazy with the details on the rock yet. Mostly just working on the general shapes. Using the grid method is extremely helpful with a very detailed painting like this, so you don't get lost on where you're working. Next, I painted the little horizon line in the background where the sea meets the sky, and I finished up sketching out the rocks. After I finished my initial sketch, I started to fill in the background sky using some Prussian blue, a little bit of ultramarine blue and phthalo blue and white, maybe a tiny dab of some dioxazine purple, using more white and pushing the brush back and forth with little sweeping motions, lifting the brush as I'm making these little arcs to create misty clouds in the background that aren't super puffy cumulus clouds. They're kind of super high up clouds that don't have a lot of body. They're more translucent. So just using my brush strokes there, that helps me to get the sky. This is just my first layer of paint for the sky. I do come back and add a little bit more vibrancy and brighten up some of my highlights. After the sky, I went in to put in a base color for those trees in the background behind the lighthouse and just try to cover up the white space. Moving back a little bit here, my canvas panel was washed with some burnt umber that was thinned down with citrus solvents, and then I let that wash dry. I didn't want to start out with a blank white canvas panel here because my lighthouse is white and I didn't want it to throw off the color I was using for the white house because I don't use pure white. I use white mixed with a hint of ochre and a little bit of Naples yellow because the lighthouse is a little bit warmer on that side where the light is hitting it. Started filling in more of the features in the lighthouse here. As I mentioned, that warm side of the lighthouse is not pure white. It's a little bit warmer with some yellows in it. And then the right side of the lighthouse and the house next to it is cooler. It's in shadow, so that I used more phthalo blue, white, maybe a hint of burnt umber too. After filling in the basic parts for the White House, not getting too detailed with windows yet, I moved down to the rocks. These rocks are really fun. There's a lot going on here with the bedding planes, the colors of the rock, all the fractures. It's really detailed. So I was taking my time with this, mostly focusing on the highlighted sections and the shadowy sections of rock first so that I didn't get lost on where I was working. I still got lost a little bit because there's just a lot going on with these rocks, guys. So yeah, if you are working on this painting, for me, the most challenging part of this painting, number one, was the rock. Just making sure I was in the right spot and getting the values and the colors accurate for the rocks. And then the second difficult part for me was the perspective on the house and the lighthouse there. I tweaked that a few times too as I was working on this painting, and I'm probably going to tweak it a little bit more after this painting is done and dry, just so that it makes me feel better. I filled in base color for the water. The water has a little bit of phthalo green, maybe some turquoise blue in there, some burnt umber as well, and a little more Prussian blue. And the water is relatively light. It's reflecting a lot of the sky. So after I got that middle tone base color, let this layer dry, then I go back and I add some highlights and shadows on the water there. What you're seeing now is after my first session was done, I let the paint dry, and now I'm working on my second session here. I am building up some of the depth in the sky, adding a little bit more Prussian blue and a little bit of dioxazine purple to my shadows in the clouds and softening up those clouds more with my brush. This is a short bristled flat tip brush, also using a filbert brush, and it's just helping me to really soften up the sky. Also using some white with a hint of Naples yellow for the highlights on the clouds, and then blending it in so it's not too bold and opaque. I'm really happy with the way the sky turned out in this painting. That was definitely the easiest part of this painting. Next, we moved forward. So this is still my second session of painting. I'm continuing to move closer to the foreground using my small flat tip brush here. And this one I'm starting to get the individual little branches on these pine trees behind the lighthouse. Being very careful here not to press too hard with the brush. I don't want to put too much force onto the brush to the canvas because that will give me a thicker brush stroke. So by using very little force while pressing, just very gently touching the canvas and thinning that paint down a little bit, I can get a much thinner, more controlled line for these branches. There's that little section of tree in the far background there. You can see it coming down into the ocean. You want to use more white and black when you're blending your colors for that section because it's farther in the distance. You want it to be less saturated and lighter in value than these trees that I've been painting in the foreground. Next, moving on to the lighthouse, I'm working on getting a nice transition between my highlight and my shadow on the lighthouse structure. Also blocking in a couple little windows here, making them a little bit more precise. For the lighthouse, that black top part of the lighthouse, you have a highlighted section on the left and a shadow section on the right. I didn't want to use pure black here. I used some indigo blue with black and a little dioxazine purple, a little bit of like an ochre color or white you could use just to bring it up a hair. You don't want it to be pure black at that distance. And then getting the angle of that lighthouse is a little tricky too, so it's going to be more of an arc because it's a circle. So you can tweak your arc if things aren't looking totally accurate. You can always make adjustments after this layer dries. You can go back again, or if you're using acrylic paint, it might be even quicker for you. Here I'm making some adjustments to the pine trees in the background, making them stand out a little bit more and giving a little more depth by adding some highlights. For your highlights on these pine trees, don't use the same color for every single pine tree. on this row here, you want to add a little bit more blues and have your highlights be a little bit less strong for the trees that are farther down on the left side of the painting, and use a little bit more of your warmer yellows for the highlights on the tree closest to the lighthouse. Working on the roof of the house next to the lighthouse. The roof is like a reddish color. I used some alizarin crimson with cadmium yellow light and white, maybe a little Naples yellow in there too for the warm highlighted section of roof. And then the cool shadowy section of the roof, I used alizarin crimson with a little bit of black, maybe a hint of blue or umber in there as well. Now I'm starting to make some adjustments and add more detail to the building. Again, still trying to keep an eye on my perspective. If you are new to painting buildings and you need some help with perspective, I can find a video and I'll leave a link below this description for you so you know what I'm talking about. Painting in the tiny little windows using my small flat tip brush. I really tried to avoid using the liner brush here. At this point in the painting, I was still thinking that I was going to get this done in a few hours. Now we're painting in the tree on the far right upper part of the painting. This section of tree, the shadows are phthalo green, sap green, burnt umber, maybe a little indigo blue too. You don't need to include any white in your shadows at these trees in the far right foreground. These trees are really close to the viewer and they're in shadow, so those can be your deepest shadows for the trees in the painting. You're also going to have more contrast here with those trees, so when I go back and add some highlights onto these trees in the upper right, those are going to be brighter than the highlights of the trees behind the lighthouse. Now I'm starting to add a little more detail to the rocks. We're blocking in some more of our highlights here. I get a little bit lost in this section. This was the trickiest part of the rocks right in the middle here. There's a big section with shadow and then a pretty strong highlight right after that. The trick to getting these rocks to look realistic is just a lot of layering. There's that base color I put down initially, and then this is my second round of painting still, where I'm darkening my shadows, boosting my highlights, further refining the details, and just keeping that same small flat tip brush for most of the rock area. Lightly pressing, not using too much force with the brush, letting the paint kind of glide around in jagged little shapes, thinning the paint down with my citrus solvents. If you don't thin the paint down, you get that more textured brush stroke, and I wasn't going for that in this painting because these rocks don't really have like a smooth transition. There's so many jagged little crevices in these rocks. I needed to thin down this paint so that I could get that more controlled line. For the colors in these rocks, that section I was working on there in the middle just below the lighthouse has a lot of that Naples yellow color, some permanent rose, a little bit of ochre, a little bit of cadmium yellow light, some white, and then the shadowy parts there have a little more umber, a little ultramarine blue, a little more permanent rose. The shadows vary so much in these rocks too. Some sections, even though it's the same type of rock, the shadow is different based on the angle of the rock with the sunlight, where it is in the painting. So try not to use the same solid color for all of your shadows. And then we also have this rock in the lower right, which has a mix of colors It's got some indigo blue in there. It's got a hint of turquoise in some of the shadows. There's some ochre, a little bit of Naples yellow in there as well. And then we have indigo and black for our deep shadows in the foreground closest to the viewer there. After that second round of paint, I let the rocks and all the other paint on the canvas dry, and then I come back for a third round of adding detail and making adjustments here. Originally, when I wanted this painting to not be super detailed, I don't know what I was thinking I was going to do for the rocks, because it would be really tough to make these rocks not look detailed and still accurate, in my opinion. Maybe I just am a sucker for detail and that's just how I roll, but that's how it ended up. Here I'm working on my third round of touching up the rocks. This is my third session of painting. I'm boosting some highlights again and boosting the shadows in more places, continuing to build up that contrast, lightening some sections up, darkening other sections, trying to find a good balance that's similar to what I'm seeing with the lighting conditions in my reference photo. Sometimes when you take a photograph, it overdoes the shadows too, and you lose some color and some light. So I'm trying to make up for that as well in this photograph, in this painting. And I'm trying to add a little bit more subtle variation in the shadows to keep the depth and make this painting have that realistic feel. When you're working on the rocks closest to the water, there is some wet water on the rocks right by the water there, and there's a really strong light reflection on the wet rocks right above the water. So just take some pure white and put some little dabs on the darker rock right above the water to show that those parts of the rock are wet. Still going back in and adding more detail, making more adjustments. As I kept painting these rocks, I started to get more of a sense of the fracture planes going on with these rocks, and then I made more adjustments with my shadows to make sure that I was painting these accurately. Just a lot of back and forth, touching up the areas around the rocks, brightening things up again. These rocks in the foreground have the brightest highlight on the angled section facing the sun, and then any other part of the rock that's not at like a 45-degree angle kind of facing the sun is cooler or has more of that Naples yellow color, but it's not the brightest highlight, so you don't want to add a super bright highlight there. Adding these highlights in specific parts of the rock help the rock to have more of that three-dimensional look, makes it look less flat. And there's a little bit of some seagrass or something kind of yellow touching the rocks down in the base of the painting here. I just use a little bit of ochre with a hint of turquoise and white to put that little bit of that yellow color in there. And then we have some deep reflections of the shadows in the water in the foreground at the middle bottom part of the canvas there. For the deep shadows, I mixed some turquoise with some burnt umber, a little bit of ultramarine blue, maybe a little indigo blue too, and just ran that flat tip brush back and forth, kind of let the brush zigzag around and create these free little movement lines on the water. I also went back and added a little more highlights into the water here, and then continued working on these rocks with another round of painting, boosting more highlights again. Just trying to bring everything to life by continuing to build that contrast and work on separating these sections of rock by adding shadows between the rock units. This rock in the foreground is the rock that I was standing on to get the photograph a little bit farther behind it. And this rock has the strongest contrast. I added some tiny little dabs of white paint on the water to show a couple little specks and highlights of reflections of light on the water. Next, I touched up the angle on my lighthouse again, refined a few more of the details, just tried to make sure that this was reading accurately and my perspective planes were accurate for the most part. They're probably not 100% accurate, but they're pretty close. I went around with another highlight on the trees using more Naples yellow, cadmium yellow light, and I put a little spring green in there too. I know that wasn't in my list of paints, but I added a little bit in there just to increase the vibrancy of the highlights on the tree in the foreground there. Next, I made another final adjustment to the shape of the top of the lighthouse, built up some of those highlights a little bit more where the sun's hitting the lighthouse, and then I signed the painting and called it a finished painting. Thanks for watching this painting tutorial, guys. I hope you enjoyed it and it helped you a little bit with your own painting. I know I kind of sped through this one. Like I said, this was probably about 10 hours in real time, so there was no way I was going to walk you through 10 hours of that, especially when I made a couple mistakes myself working on this one. Overall, I'm very happy with the finished product. This painting will be in my upcoming solo exhibition in Pittsburgh in October of 2021. If you guys would like to find out more about my upcoming solo art exhibition, then you can subscribe to my newsletter. You can sign up for my newsletter in the link below this description, stephmoracafineart.com. Thanks for watching, guys. If you have any recommendations for future painting tutorials, leave a comment below letting me know. Have a great day and happy painting! Bye-bye!